Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. Welcome again to this fantastic panel. I'm really, really excited about this panel and the makeup of this panel. I think we've got some wonderful perspectives. It's a privilege to host you for it. The focus of the panel is Are Enterprises Embracing Tokenization? How are global brands utilizing blockchain to improve their supply chain? To lead this panel of experts, I couldn't ask for someone more qualified, someone I've worked with for the past 6 months to a year during the course of the pandemic. Martha Bennett, Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. Martha, the floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much for the introduction. I'll add my own welcome, whichever greeting applies to your time zone. Very welcome to this panel. Very briefly, background to myself, and then I'll introduce the topic and the panel. I've been in and around emerging technologies for over 30 years now, and I picked up on the overall topic of enterprise blockchain in late 2014. So I've been covering this space and having the pleasure to meet with companies trying to figure out how to use blockchain, using blockchain over time, and have gained a lot of insight. And it's always a huge pleasure and honor for me to moderate a panel with such diverse representation and interesting projects. So this is about the panelists. I will include some of my own observations, maybe a little bit of my research findings where appropriate. But before I hand it over to the panelists, I want to provide a little bit of background to the topic, because some of you may think, why are we putting tokenization and utilizing supply chain, using blockchain for supply chain in the same discussion? There will be those of you who will say, well, yes, that's because. Those of you who think why, bear with us. It will become very obvious. But what I'll also say straight up front is that we'll flip the topics around a bit, and we'll actually start with the supply chain discussion before we get more into the tokenization discussion. But before we do that, I will ask each one of our panelists to introduce her or himself, name, rank, and number, and very briefly, not in too much detail, but very briefly, what your involvement is with either blockchain projects or tokenization projects, or both if applicable, in your organization. And I'll take the sequence the way I can see it on my screen, which means that I will ask Pramita to go first.
Thanks, Martha, and thanks, everyone. I'm really excited to be on this panel. So my name is Pramita Mitra, and I am a research supervisor at Ford Motor Company Research and Innovation Center in Dearborn, Michigan. And my research focuses on applications of IoT and blockchain technologies in the automotive supply chain and manufacturing space. I'm also a computer scientist by training, and I have a PhD in distributed and mobile computing systems. And last but not the least, I also co-chair the supply chain working group of Mobility Open Blockchain Initiative, or MOBI in short, which is a cross-industry consortium of multiple automakers, suppliers, and blockchain technology providers. And a shameless plug that we just published our first industry standard on June 14th, which was yesterday, for using blockchain technology to increase transparency and trust in the automotive supply chain. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the update. I regard it as a valuable update, not a plug. Diana, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Lawrence and Martha. I'm really excited to talk to all of you, fantastic panelists, and it's a great update on Pramita's side as well. Market industry standards are so important in this new space, so that's fantastic that the automotive industry is getting into that conversation. Well, I'm the director of ESG and impact at an investment bank called Emergence at Wield & Co. We fall under the umbrella of Wield & Co., basically founded by David Wield, who's known as the father of the Jobs Act. What we do is we're bridging the gap between digital assets and traditional financial services. So we're really founded upon a lot of research on early stage companies and capital formation to promote future growth. And as you can imagine, we do focus on emerging technologies, including blockchain. And that includes the realm of projects that use some degree of tokenization. First of all, tokenization is a very broad topic, so it can take many forms through different startups. And I'm really excited to be facilitating the growth of those startups through easier access to capital formation. I've also been involved in publications on market infrastructure where I've written about stablecoins, central bank digital currencies in respect to tokenized assets. I'm a Forbes contributor as well in these topics, and I've built a blockchain discussion forum out of Yale. Prior to this, I've also advised the Parliament of Cyprus in their blockchain regulation, which includes a lot of conversation on tokenized assets. And prior to that, I used to work in international development. So.
Great, thank you. Alberto.
All right, thank you for the opportunity, Marta. I am Alberto Cozer. I am with Nestle. At Nestle, I am part of two teams. One team that's responsible for global IT innovation, and with a focus in manufacturing, but also with some key projects and key initiatives in blockchain, mostly on the supply chain side of the house, but also other initiatives, and also part of IT platforms that it's the group that provides the necessary platforms for making a digital reality for us. And my experience with blockchain dates back to probably close to 2014, 2015, more recently. But I like to say, and as we discussed before in the pre-panel, that I can trace back the concepts and what we're talking about in blockchain back to 1996 with some of the cryptography applications that we had that later on came to make blockchain a reality, not only for crypto, but also for smart contracts, for tokenization, and many of the topics we're going to be discussing here today. It's an exciting topic. It's something that I have been connected with for many years now, and continue to be so, because I see in that part of an important foundation for digital transformation in the future, as we're going to be discussing here today.
That's great, thank you. And then last but by no means least, Dale, and I'll ask a little extra of you so I don't have to keep on jumping in, is after you've introduced yourself, if you could also provide us with your, I think you call it satellite view perspective, that would be great.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope all are well, and thanks for joining us. It's my honor. It feels like you need about 2 Nobel Peace Prizes to sit on this panel, so I'll do my best to hold my own here, but what an impressive group, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm Dale Chrystie. I'm business fellow and blockchain strategist for FedEx. I'm located in the Memphis area of the US, the central part of the US. I bring you greetings, where FedEx is headquartered. And I have spent a career in transportation, done many things, but my brain kind of connects dots. So that's led me to process improvement and quality and strategy and a number of things over the years. And so I'm a relative newcomer to blockchain compared to some on this panel, which is, I think it was late 2016, early 2017 when we got involved and did our first use case in early 2017. But it resonated with me well beyond the use case. The use case was a basic 3-party use case with a shipper, a receiver, and a carrier. And frankly, it probably wasn't a wonderful, I mean, it still applies, but it wasn't a wonderful use case necessarily. It just opened our eyes to what was in the realm of the possible. But the real aha moment for me, and I think where Martha wants me to go here, is the real aha moment is that because FedEx goes to 220 countries and territories, that has given me the luxury of something that not many people have, which is that the default position is essentially the International Space Station. And while that sounds kind of big and grandiose, at that level, there is no FedEx, there is no industry, and there are no borders. And so I have had the luxury of being able to kind of contemplate and work with others within FedEx and elsewhere to kind of think of what that looks like. Certainly we have interest and we've done our own, built our own little global supply chain blockchain several years ago, et cetera, et cetera. But the learning and the perspective here, I think, is where this goes. And so I'll offer the following comments kind of to prep where the rest of this conversation goes on this panel, which is, we see a lot of people that since that time have been trying to create, consortiums, 3 or 4 people or 6 people or whatever the number might be, and everybody signs a non-disclosure and everybody kind of moves forward from that point of view. But from an industry point of view, we're in global commerce. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of entities, all the way to a bicycle delivery company. Those consortia models may work in a different scenario from that point of view. If you had an industry where if you could get 30 or 50 or 70 people signed up and you'd have the entire industry, certainly there's all kinds of interesting things you could do at that point in time. But that was the fork in the road that we got to, which is, we don't actually think in global commerce that the consortium model will scale. We think there's too much friction in that space. On the contrary, the fork in the road is, if you could hang an Apache license or an MIT open license kind of on the door frame of this virtual conference room that we're all in and say, I'm okay with that. Yeah, I can live with that. Come on in. We think it just scaled globally. And so our default position is this broader global position. And certainly, not only will peer-to-peer technology be very interesting for that, but as it relates to both enterprise and supply chain, we've now lived through a real world example, a real world laboratory experiment in the last 18 months for global supply chains. We have never been, as a globe, more aware and our eyes wide open to how fragile this global supply chain is and how many steps are there. I mean, this is, if I had a picture right now in the US, when there are floods, people are handing sandbags to each other. So you've got this person handing, and then the next bag and the next bag. Well, a lot of these business processes look like that right now. And so the kind of technology that comes about with peer-to-peer relationships, where something that sits between supply and demand may not have the value moving forward that it does today. And if Martha and I can find each other across an ocean or across a border or examples, it does all kinds of things for us. Between peer-to-peer technology, smart contracts, and those kinds of things. Again, as early 2018, our chairman and founder sat on stage at Consensus in New York City and said, blockchain is going to completely change worldwide supply chains. And then he finished by saying, if you're not operating at the edge of this technology and the edge of this innovation, you need to be prepared to be commoditized or potentially to become extinct. So certainly we at the highest levels of FedEx believe that this will transform supply chains. And finally, our CIO later said, for blockchain to be transformative, it has to be bigger than us. We don't believe we can slap a FedEx logo on it, have the world come to it, or pay us to use it, or our competitors, or vice versa. That further enhances this broad global view of that. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Martha. But again, our view of this is at the global level, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dale. And I'm just sort of thinking back to what you've said here as well, which I seem to recall is sort of reading between the lines, what you're also saying there, that yes, of course, competition will still exist, but it's at a different level.
Yeah, and that's the word, and I didn't use my word, but I'll come back to that word, which is the word I use is Coopetation. And I've been using that word now for several years. And just one example of that is we are part of a trade association that only has 3 members. It's FedEx, UPS, and DHL. And so Coopetation is not an antitrust kind of a thing, because those are hard and fast rules and nobody crosses those lines. That is not it. Coopetation is, it's not about where we compete, it's about where we can agree. And so where we can agree, in that case, the 3 of us work together to create a position paper on emerging blockchain and emerging technologies that we provided to World Customs and World Trade in 2019. And we worked on it together. So where can we agree? We can agree that if we can reduce friction across borders, that's paper, resources, waste, all kinds of things, where we can reduce friction across borders, we win, our customers win, global trade also wins. We've also worked, and by the way, the government, the US government, US Customs has the same vision of this. They see a digitized future of this as well. So all that connects back into this broader supply chain discussion.
It does indeed, but also at this point, I will bring it back to where we are today, because, and in fact, one of the slides that I created must have been 2015 that I still use, which I call Think Big, Start Small. Because you've got to start with, and I see a few nods here, and in fact, sorry, Pramita, you're giving me the broadest smile here, so I'll turn it over to you, because you've got to, you can't just say to companies, we do business completely differently today or tomorrow. It doesn't work like that. Where are you starting? How have you started at Ford? What initiatives have you got underway? And also, you obviously wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't a benefit to be had. What's it mean for you to work towards that strategic vision, and what's the today like?
Thanks, Martha, for that question. So I have to admit that myself and Ford are also kind of newcomers to the blockchain space. Our blockchain journey also started around 2017, 2018. And we believe that we are still in that research phase, but we are seeing a lot of potential and trying to understand the benefits for the use cases we have in supply chain and how might that impact the actual bottom line of the business, right? So we have a little bit of point of view from a research standpoint, and we are looking at this technology as an enabler for a secure and verifiable system for exchanging data in a multi-party workflow. That's how we define it. And one example of a very complex multi-party workflow is the automotive supply chain, right? And if you kind of follow the life cycle of an automotive part, it starts all the way from sourcing the raw material, followed by creating the part, and then assembling it into a vehicle, then its life and usage in the field with the customer, and finally the end of life, right? And now you would notice that there are so many different stakeholders at different phases of this life cycle, starting from the material supplier, the part manufacturer, the car manufacturer, which is us, the end customer, such as either the owner of the vehicle or commercial fleet managers, then the dealership, the automotive repair centers, and finally the end of life processors, such as the scrap yards and the recyclers of the world, right? So we look at blockchain as a technology that might enable all these stakeholders to collaborate securely and efficiently using this immutable distributed ledger provided by this technology, which in turn would allow us to create standardized frameworks and achieve some common objectives in the ecosystem, right? Such as increasing part and material provenance and traceability end-to-end, also ensuring responsible sourcing and sustainability, and identifying and verifying genuine OE parts in the field, and also detecting counterfeit parts as well, right? And protecting the safety and experience of our customers. So we also believe that if all these stakeholders are referring to the same underlying ledger, then we will be able to overcome the need for many bilateral or two-way agreements that we have in the supply chain today. And by doing that, we will also eliminate solutions which are standalone, and that's why they don't really scale very well with time, right? And if it is okay, I would like to kind of explain this a little bit more with a real life example. So this is a research project called Responsible Sourcing Blockchain Network, or RSBN in short, that Ford is working on for a while. From a technology standpoint, it's a private and permission blockchain network that uses the Hyperledger Fabric platform underneath it. This network was launched by IBM in 2019, and today it includes multiple car makers, cathode and battery manufacturer, and even cobalt suppliers like Vayu Chemical. So we know that the electric vehicle batteries use a significant amount of cobalt in them. And this solution that we have been piloting, has demonstrated that the cobalt produced at the industrial mining sites in Democratic Republic of Congo could be traced all the way through its supply chain, starting from the production in Africa to a cathode and battery manufacturing plant in Asia, and finally to a Ford assembly plant in Mexico. And we are really excited with the recent launch of our all-electric Mustang Mach-E SUV, that we believe this solution could potentially become an important tool to strengthen the transparency and visibility in our global mineral supply chain. And we also hope that in future, this network could be expanded beyond cobalt to other precious minerals used in the battery. And that's how we hope to compound the positive impact of this solution or blockchain technology in general to address issues like human rights protection and child labor practices in these kinds of conflicted territories of our global supply chain.
Thank you for that. And I will park that until we get to the tokenization discussion. But one thing that just occurred to me as well with what you've described there is also a carbon footprint element, which you probably are already tracking as part of the project, but thereby hangs some more, as I'm sure Diana will come back to. But let's stick with supply chain for the moment, because I think provenance and traceability is something that's very core to what you've been involved with, Alberto.
Absolutely. That is, to begin with, there's one thing that I always like to mention. People look at blockchain as, let's say, start blockchain as a database where they will be able to trace things on top of that database. And while that makes sense, because it's one of the introductions of the topic, and it makes it easier for people who are not familiar with blockchain to understand what blockchain is capable of. That's barely skimming the surface of the true potential of blockchain. Is really what you build on top of that, and the potential that by having that common ground of data repository allows you to do in the long run, and build on top of this data, because really data is the, let's say, the fabric or the building blocks that you have for anything that's related with blockchain, and how you accelerate the adoption of this platform with players that will add to this data and will bring more value to the data and will bring more data to your ledger, and also leverage the possibilities of blockchain to automate the capture and the intake of this data. Blockchain will only be as good as the quality of the data that you put in, and the difference between typical traditional database that would track your supply chain into a traditional database and blockchain is that, first, blockchain is a lot more automatable, if I could use this word, than a traditional database, for one. And the second is you have more eyes and you have more people with skin in the game in the blockchain verifying the data that is in there. And this is one of the fundamental changes that when we design the systems and when we design the platform, sometimes we forget. We look and we oversimplify as, let's start with a database, let's put the data in there, and we forget about these other aspects, which are really where the true potential and let's say it creates a fertile soil for any of the ideas that you may have or your corporate may have on the use of blockchain for the future that could bring value. It's what is of value for your consumer, for your client buying a car, for our consumers buying our products that are traceable on the blockchain? Is it just the fact that you can query something, or is it the connections that this data and these elements they have in between themselves, and what it means to you? What it means to you, for example, to buy a Ford vehicle that you can trace and it's sourced in a certain way, and you just mentioned, Marta, the carbon footprint of that as well. Is this certified somehow? Is that of value for me as a customer, as a consumer, and how I interact with this data as well on the blockchain, which is another aspect of it.
Oh, that's great. And what I also find in a way, it's refreshing to see that you are taking, and when I say you, I mean both Pramita and Alberto with your respective organizations, that approach to go where there is something familiar, address issues that exist, looking at the strategic potential, because what I'm about to broaden out into, that really is very much still at the leading edge, and also one area where I will say, where the real, and when I say the real world, I mean the world of regulation, of legislation, still has to catch up. Because, you know, given that the title of this conference, FinTech Connect, let me make the FinTech connection. Everything you've just described somewhere touches upon a financial services element as well. There is a payment, there are invoices, there are bills of lading, bills of material, carbon footprints, as I've just mentioned. I will actually, and I should probably also admit that I've actually written a report called Asset Tokenization, Invent the Future, which is this is very early stages, but what I'm seeing is that on a lot of supply chain track and trace projects, a lot of the item, when I say items, it could be an invoice or it could be actual goods, are already tokenized purely for tracking purposes, and that's just fine. But once you've got something tokenized and it's programmable, to your point, Alberto, around automation, this is when you can also think about doing other things with that token, like having invoice financing directly related, trade finance. I've come across, and that's why I picked up on Pramita's comments around the ESG aspect. There are already companies, and Diana, you'll probably have a lot more examples, that are actually turning a carbon footprint into a tradable token, because if you have a very favorable carbon footprint in a way that actually increases the value of your stock. So there are all kinds of possibilities that I will leave to Diana to outline as well, outside of some of the financial instruments that we already have. But I do also just want to pick up again on Alberto's comment about data quality, because that is one of the myths that I continue encountering. Does that blockchain magically improves data quality? No, it doesn't. It's not only garbage in, garbage out, it's garbage in, garbage forever. What it does help you is with data integrity, and as you've both also eloquently outlined, is that everybody has the same version of the truth, which should be the truth, provided the data has been input correctly. But anyway, enough from me. Diana, tokenization, what's happening in your world?
Absolutely. And first of all, to draw the connections, I'm gonna start to connect the dots here, and completely agree with a lot of the points said here. They're very valid points in terms of co-opetition and creating the efficiencies and essentially growing the pie through blockchain and reducing the information silos, so that the benefits can reach broader communities, but through reducing frictions precisely, as well as quality of data, right? We're experimenting in a sense with new business models, right, that are managing data, and in the realm of supply chain, we have the advantage of connecting the journeys of data that blockchain provides, right? Connecting, there might be some sub-supply chains within a farm, or for the transportation, or within the grocery store, and connecting the entire journeys of data across the supply chains to get a more holistic view. And that's precisely the holistic view that adds transparency, which leads to more accountability, which leads to the ESG component of accountability to make better business decisions across the board. Again, in the realm of supply chain, I do have a couple of numbers from the organizations, international organizations of trade. The average international trade transaction, for example, has historically involved 36 original documents, 240 copies, 27 entities. There's an $81 billion yearly supply chain costs for Fortune 500 companies. And this leads to just the sheer amount of jurisdictions, shareholders, the amounts of different cross-border currencies and documentation that you could very easily streamline through the use of tokenized tokenized collateral and tokenized representations of assets across the supply chains. Because again, like I mentioned, tokenization is a very broad topic. And right now, where are we standing with respect to tokenization? And it could be a tokenized representation of an asset, and tokens can also represent, be attached to representations of rights and obligations. So it's a wealth of different possibilities that you can tokenize that are really opening and broadening a lot of opportunities that businesses can leverage and capitalize through the realm of transparency. One really important topic to consider through tokenization is making sure that there is an adequate level of liquidity, especially in marketplaces. If there is an adequate number of liquidity, that's the only way to reach the required network effects for buyers to find enough sellers, for lenders to find enough borrowers, and all the transactions that are involved behind not just supply chain, but anything that happens in marketplaces, because supply chains move forward through transactions, through agreements, right? Because of all the different stakeholders. So let's take a step back and talk about those transactions and agreements in the first place in these marketplaces, right? So this scale really essentially also requires alignment of incentives across the parties involved, across jurisdictions, and it requires buy-in from participating entities and high-level agreements at an institutional level, as well as technical updates, which can take some time to complete and reach the required buy-in from the key stakeholders. But once you reach that level of buy-in, that's where you can essentially grow the pie, right? By ensuring the reduced frictions, the quality data going into the picture, and the co-opetition, right? Without the right level of liquidity, otherwise we could hinder adequate market efficiency and price discovery, and this could lead to implications on trade execution if there's a low and fragmented level of demand that may hinder clearing and settlement, for example. And also the requirements of legal and regulatory frameworks to support and incentivize the adoption of tokenized forms of representations of assets that would lead to the right levels of liquidity. So having mentioned the importance of liquidity, my next point would be the role of tokenized assets through tokenized collateral. And this is where we talk about transactions, right? Forms of payment, right? Tokenized collateral could take the form of a central bank digital currency or a stable coin, which we could define as a representation of some sort of reserves held at a bank or a central bank, some form of currency that could be used for existing enterprises to transact with each other across borders in a frictionless way, right? So tokenized collateral on a blockchain-based platform could greatly reduce the time gap between the calculation of things like variation margins and settlement, and that could create a lot of efficiencies. And when we talk about marketplaces and really building the next generation of marketplaces, tokens would be adequate legal representation of their underlying assets as well as underlying value, right? And that allows the ability to move in and out of contracts legally and efficiently with less intermediary fees, because we're talking about peer-to-peer transactions. Trades in tokenized assets can therefore be made much more effective than in traditional financial services where we see all the frictions that we encounter. So here I'm talking about the potential for tokenized securities and tokenized forms of cash, right? And it's important here. We're talking about a vision right now that hasn't necessarily been implemented, but how do we get started, right? And I think it's important to get started by making sure that we focus tokenization initiatives on areas where there's already a strong demand, right? We could tokenize and bring liquidity to assets that are otherwise less liquid, but that's going to take a little bit of time to unfold and the markets to develop and create the right levels of buyers and sellers and interest and the regulatory requirements behind that. But I think low-hanging fruit in order to create adoption would be where are the marketplaces where there's already significant demand, and creating tokenization incentives in that realm to transition markets pretty quickly, and also determining the right blockchain structures with the right implications. And finally, to talk about examples and what's being done today. There are a lot of examples being piloted for tokenized collateral as a form of payment. This has shown to provide faster payments, like I mentioned, faster margin calculations, and the next generation of market infrastructure that would run on trading tokenized assets. Tokenized assets may represent financial securities or they may not. So we're entering, tokens could potentially allow for some sort of barter system where representations of all different kinds of assets and rights and responsibilities that come with them can be exchanged in a marketplace, which allows for a whole set of new opportunities. And the forms of using currency and payment to make those exchanges are something that's being developed right now, especially at the central bank digital currency level, which would have pretty much represent an avenue toward adoption of these infrastructures. There have been several proofs of concept and experiments integrating tokenized digital assets and forms of central bank digital money. And one example would be the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, has an innovation hub, and in partnership with the Swiss National Bank and the digital asset trading platform, Project Helvetia has experimented with the clearing and settlement of tokenized assets using central bank digital money as an example. So it's really interesting to think of the opportunities that these forms of collateral could be very easily used to reduce frictions for large companies that are transacting in large cross-border transactions, and particularly with the use case of supply chains.
And again, to kind of draw the connections here a little bit, you quite rightly point out that a lot of this is very much in the future, and most companies, they're not ready for it. Regulation, legislation in many places isn't ready for it, and yet it is starting. And if I look at the kinds of tokenized assets that already exist, in my research I've come across tokenized racehorses, a tokenized container ship, tokenized fine wine. Now, having mentioned in particular the fine wine where there is a lot of fraud, and you have similar issues, not with wine necessarily, but with your product in both the automotive and the food industries, you still need to ensure that the physical product is what it's meant to be and stays what it should be throughout the journey, where blockchain has a role to play. So picking up from Diana, I'm very much of in many ways the future is happening, but it's also not something where we say everybody will participate like today or even tomorrow. It's early days. It's more about engaging. But Dale, you've been doing a lot of nodding. Is there something you'd like to pick up on?
Well, I think that we're talking about the future, right? And so I think that we've actually spent a long time to get to this point. I mean, when we talk about how many years the people on this panel collectively have been involved with this, it's an impressive number of years. And yet I think we've spent much of that time talking about the technology. And so if we get to the who, FedEx, what blockchain, when, we all want to know the answer to that one. I think where Diana and where others have now talked, I think we've got to get to the why. I think why is very interesting to me right now, and I want it to be more and more interesting to many others. Certainly the technology is important. Certainly I'm a big supporter of that, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we've actually slowed down this adoption by focusing it in the R&D group and the innovation group and kind of the skunk works group, where you've got a small group of people talking about the technology and all the rest of those things. And I have to keep bringing it back over to kind of the C-suite side of things, which is why? Why should we care about this? Even if we don't use the B word, even if we don't use blockchain, what are the capabilities of that? What are the things that speak to business leaders? And those are things all the way from accounts receivable to, as Diana and others have talked about, the friction that's in these processes, the waste that's in these processes. It's not just a let's go jump on a brand new technology. Why are we in business and why are we doing this? And how can these capabilities help us move forward? And that's where the business conversation, the risk and opportunity discussion with C-suite comes into play. And then I think that leads us into, wait a second, I could tokenize my entire supply chain. There's value in each of those pieces of that. Where does that take us? And it's not like trying to convince everybody to go into a brand new business model. You're in that business. You are experts at that business. How can you be aware of, again, disrupt or be disrupted with this kind of technology? Where can this take you? Or where might you be vulnerable to some of the items that this panel is talking about? So the why, I think, is still very interesting to me. And I want to be an evangelist toward that, toward the group, which is it's not just technology for technology's sake. This is allowing us to contemplate things that we've literally never been able to contemplate before. So I would, people say, well, blockchain, that hype thing and this and that. And I would argue that whether or not any of what we're talking about actually comes true around blockchain, it has already changed the conversation. It's already changed the world in the realm of the possible. Wait a second, peer-to-peer technology and the other kinds of things that we're now contemplating are a very different world, a world with much less friction, and where you can identify and manage value. And we've never been able to put our hands around that value before. So again, that's the piece that I'm nodding to is yes, 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 but we got to get not just the innovation groups talking about it, we got to get the C-suite and the business leaders understanding, and wait a second, this could transform my business. Or by the way, somebody could transform my business in a way that I don't want it to. That's why I need to be involved and understand the impact of all these things, to include the tokenization piece.
Alberto, you've been doing a lot of nodding. What are your, because I know from our pre-discussion that you're having a lot of business conversations. What goes into those? What can you share?
I love what I've heard from Diana and Dale as well, and I couldn't agree more. I think we must never forget why we're doing things, why we're bringing technology. Technology is supposed to be an enabler to the consumers, to the clients, to the partners, and to the business as a whole. Blockchain has a lot of very deep technical discussions that people fail to connect with. And that's what drives people away in one sense. And then we also have some elements of blockchain that when people feel they connect to, they get hit by a train, like people who got into blockchain because they wanted to trade crypto or because they wanted to trade tokens 2 years ago. And that's also why the token, there's the B word and there's the T word as well in blockchain, because of what happened and started happening 2 years ago, because we saw one of the possibilities of token that was to help enable and bootstrap some of the blockchain possibilities. And of course, there's a hype with new technology, and then many of the initial adopters are going to lose their investment on that one. But I think we are at a much more mature stage of the whole development of token and tokenization that allows and opens up the doors for many other possibilities. And if you ask me, as Dale mentioned, what are the whys? There's so many whys you would do certain things in blockchain versus on another technology. But I think there's two words that come to mind when I think about it. The first is trust. We talked about reducing friction. And one of the key aspects in blockchain that helps reduce friction is how easily it solves the trust problem. A lot of the friction in finance, in the finance industry, has to do with trust. You know, I don't trust you, I don't trust him, I don't trust them, and we need elements in the middle to create this chain of trust. That blockchain is built on top of that. It's like from the ground up. That's what blockchain is about. And the second thing is about speed. Blockchain allows you to do certain things, not only because it reduces all this friction with the implementation of trust, but it accelerates transactions. It accelerates transfer of assets. Blockchain has technology for you to digitalize assets by means of crypto anchors, for example, and that allows transfers of contracts, transfers of interest, transfers of anything that you could think of a financial element, as well as supply chain and production in many aspects of manufacturing and the production cycle, that it's unparalleled. It's never been seen before in the industry. I don't think we've ever had a technology that has enabled speed so much as blockchain since the inception and large adoption of internet and telecommunications as we have today. So this is definitely the next step. Now, many of the whys are still not clear to us. The same way, the farther you go back in the past to try to describe that very first equations that describe what happened right after the Big Bang, it starts, the closer you get to that, it starts to get more and more fuzzy, and you can't really see what's going on in there. The farther you go into the future, the more difficult it is to predict the future. So we can only make certain bets, but I think we have a very solid ground and to work on and predict what's going to happen. So will blockchain transform the future of finance, of supply chain? Absolutely, yes. It already has done so. As Dale mentioned, we're already talking about this. It's changing the conversation. How it's going to change, the specifics for each industry, it's still hard to contemplate. And many of the things, even things that we take for granted today, that, well, of course, the future of blockchain is going to go in that direction, think twice, because we have had great technologies in the past that, we were certain that they would go in a certain route, and they derailed somehow. So let's learn from the past, so we are careful with our bets and what we're looking at. Also, that's why when it comes to enterprise adoption, many companies, Ford is one example, FedEx, Nestle as well, we are still in a stage where we want to be leading in this area because we're connected with technology, with digital. We're going through serious digital transformation as a way to continue to be relevant in business. But we are also experimenting with all this to really understand what is of value for us as a business, what is of value for consumers and customers, what are the elements of that we could translate to them. And this is what's going to help us start answering the whys. Diana talked about liquidity. I couldn't agree more. It is a fantastic element for liquidity. And if you asked me about this probably 3 years ago, I would think, well, we're probably not there yet. And then we had that hype of the, hyper tokenization that we went through, and we, many failed, many projects derailed, but there's some projects that matured after that, and new projects are being built on top of that. And this is fantastic, because today I see a clear path when it comes to creating liquidity in markets and for assets that we didn't have before. And I only see this growing. It's, of course, it's not a surprise that we have central banks interested on that, because it also brings another element to money that they tried to implement before, and they failed at that, even with the adoption of multiple different technologies and IT systems in finance, which is first full traceability and transparency about the use of money, but also the creation of rules around it, which blockchain allows you to do. What is that money going to be good for? What is that token going to be good for? What can you use and what you cannot use it against? The simple concept of being able to create financial assets that expire, it's fantastic. That, if you think about it, could you have that in a centralized world? Probably yes, but then the trust friction, the trust element would probably prevent this from growing much further than from an initial group.
Big things indeed. And I've actually got a couple of audience questions here that kind of map onto a lot of what we've collectively just discussed. Flipping it round a little bit, the first question here is, what do the panelists feel are the biggest hurdles to large-scale DLT adoption? And here's the clincher. What is their perceived solution to those problems? I would say, not sure we have answers, but who would like to have a first go at providing a perspective? Okay, Dale, you got there first. I should also mention that we have very little time left, so we should probably try and keep it concise, but sorry, Dale.
That's okay. I'll give you 60 seconds. I think it's the word coopetition. Again, I can tell you in our own journey, when we start talking about that, we get lots of recoil and reaction from that. And I would tell you that it's just not taught on your first day of work, and it's not taught at very many business schools yet. Though a good friend of mine who is a professor at University of Arkansas has it in her book and is teaching it, so she corrected me recently. It is starting to be taught, but it's not intuitive for me to sit down with the other panelists here and to literally just like work with each other. And so that's why it's so unusual for somebody like FedEx, UPS, and DHL to calmly work together on a position paper where it's, again, it's not about where we compete, it's about where we can agree. But I think the culture is part of the issue that's slowing this down. The technology will come. It's not yet very fast or scalable or mature. It will come, but the culture has to also embrace this concept, because right now, if we aren't working together, said another way, I am working against all of you. And that's not going to speed any of this up.
Yeah.
Any other perspectives? Sorry.
I'll take it, this question as well, and I'll connect it with the why question, which I love as a way to confront those challenges, right? And when we really ask ourselves, like, what can we do about this, or why is it not being implemented the way we want it, or what's going to be the vision and how it's going to be executed, it's something that we really, I connect the dots and I bring it back to ESG in terms of why. Like, it's really about making good business decisions. And first of all, the environmental piece, the carbon credits, for example, the environmental issues are very linked with social issues, and they're very integrated. When one goes down, the other one goes down. And that's one thing that I think should be more focused on, because oftentimes when we think of ESG, we think of just environmental issues, but there's a lot of social issues, implications that go along with each other. And it all really trickles down from the governance. So it all really trickles down from making business decisions. And how do we make business decisions in a more transparent and open manner by really integrating it with the cultures of companies? And I think that's a big challenge. How it's difficult to change corporate cultures, and it's something that we really have to do. And that's where I really see the role of blockchain and connect it with ESG, because if we really talk about the concept of governance, how do we really ingrain these topics from the top down and also from bottom up in a way that the top corporate decision makers integrate the concept of awareness and transparency and efficiency within every single component of their decision-making structures. And then it trickles down across the corporate culture and down to the employees that are interacting with the customers and the ultimate beneficiaries of a product. They can also bring feedback to the top in a way that creates a feedback loop of open communications that in the end improve businesses. And again, why businesses? We live in a very connected world. We depend on businesses. We live in a world today where the role of large businesses, their revenues, their profits are in many ways equivalent or even bigger than the GDPs of entire countries, right? And how can you really do that and live in that world if businesses don't really have a sense of checks and balances like governments have, right? So that's really the importance and the role of management and the feedback loops, open communications, and transparency and accountability. But again, it's hard to change corporate cultures, but through transparency and accountability, we could get there. Mm-hmm.
Pramita, what resonates with you on that? Where do you see, given the limited time left, take your pick whether you want to talk more about the hurdles or how they can be overcome, or the whys. But it would be great to have your perspective on a lot of the things that we've just discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, I want to say that I really enjoyed listening to this conversation, and I could have just gone on listening. Really loved so much of all the comments, and I think I just want to talk a little bit or reinforce the cultural aspect a little bit, and then from a technology and standard kind of emphasize on the value of standardization and what else needs to happen in future from the experiments we have been running at Ford, right? So definitely agree that just like Dale or Diana said, automotive industry is no exception. The blockchain space in automotive is also filled with technical experts. And if we really want our experimental pilots to move to production, we have to get out of this geek bubble that we have, right? And focus on really moving towards creating industry-wide solutions for digital mobility ecosystem. That's what we have been calling it at Mobi, and that's really the big picture that kind of Dale was talking about, right? The satellite view. And it has to be then much less about the discussion about the technology, which you all pointed out. And then, it has to be about then developing really meaningful use cases and pilots. And one thing is very critical I have seen in the auto industry is accurate quantification of the impact of a pilot, right? And that kind of in turns helps with accurate quantification of okay, if I implemented this use case, what is the impact on my bottom line? And one of my absolute favorites is one of the very first Hyperledger case studies done by Walmart, where the latency of tracking the origin and movement of a mango from their farm to retail stores was reduced from 7 days to 2.2 seconds using blockchain, right? And we really need to come up with more powerful stories like that. So that's kind of my 2 cents on the cultural aspect. And I know that we're running out of time. So I also kind of want to really talk about the technology aspect a little bit. In order to realize much of the benefits, I think, blockchain also has to see a convergence with other technologies such as IoT and AI. And I think in future, we are just going to be figuring out things like how to use decentralized identity standards to successfully marry IoT with blockchain for both connected consumer experience as well as, smart factory environments. And I know that, we talked a little bit about tying that physical part, that part that is tokenized reliably with its digital identity or representation on blockchain. And that's really where the W3C standards like DID, which is a decentralized identifier standard, really will help us to assign unique and verifiable identities to these IoT devices, and then allow us to digitally sign and verify this data coming out of these devices at their very origin, right? And then also from AI standpoint, I think, when we are talking about sharing data with our partners and suppliers, really, we have to, I think that conversation becomes much easier if we stop talking about, oh, you need to absolutely report out your raw data, right? I don't think there is a need to do that. And the technology is advancing and catching up so that we don't need to do that. And one of the things that has really excited me in the recent is something called federated learning, right? Where you can really you have this decentralized and privacy preserving solution that holds the raw data on the devices, on the edge devices, and trains the learning model locally on those devices, right? So it's really easy to see why IoT or federated learning and blockchain will have to go hand in hand if we want to materialize some of the benefits we all talked about.
Thank you so much. You've managed to pack an amazing amount in there. There is another question which we don't have time to answer, and partly also because it probably wouldn't be quite fair to ask you the question because it's about how much your respective companies are expecting to save. I'll take that one at the highest level because you've already said quantification is important. So yes, and companies are looking at it, and there are actually some amazing savings. It's obviously use case specific. Are you saving, as you just mentioned with the example, something that used to take 3 weeks takes 3 seconds. I've got examples from where over 80% of invoices used to be subject to some form of dispute resolution. Now it's under 2%. All that can be quantified because you know how many people you're using for the process. Then there is the other aspect, which is cost avoidance, not being fined or, so much there that we cannot possibly discuss, and I'm being told that we're going to be kicked off. So with that, all I can really do is apologize to anybody who didn't get a last word in, but I don't think we want the technology to finish this. If there is something very brief, Alberto or Dale, or Diana, that you just want to throw in as a very final comment, up to you. And if the system cuts us off, I apologize to all who attended and thank you for coming.
I'd
Yeah, I
just
wanna
like to
say
thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a great conversation.
Mhm.
Well, thank you.
Likewise,
In
it's
that
been my
case,
honor.
let's
Thanks,
hand
Dawn.
over to Lawrence before the technology kicks us out.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, panelists. It's always a pleasure. I really enjoyed this. I hope everyone else did. Thank you. I'm going to say thank you and goodbye before I get kicked off. So have good evenings and good days.
Have a
Thank
good rest of
you.
the day wherever you are. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.